We grew up in the hood like most black folks. Little did they know that comes gorillas from the south coast, breaking the booze out, living and broken in many pieces. Black rain for not five, explosion posse going to sit with this revolutionary tactic. Them flips up out of my mattress. I practice pro-blackness, not to say I'm prejudice, what's in the darkness. No, I'm not suicidal, but I'm dying for my people. No, I'm not naive, yet I distinguish good from evil. I use the world on grounds, align my mind to burn from ignorance. I cut away my perm, I got strong, some can't deal with this mentality. Thinking I'm weak, I'm not no gangster. It won't be televised how many times my posse pull a trigger. Lord, oh Lord, am I the devil too, or am I really the son? Unto the throne, son, the flock is true. Image of you, a portrait that I could not never see. Dumb as I may be, I never go, I kamikaze G. Genocide.
Class can be anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. It really just depends on participation, if you have any questions, and how we dialogue. I do like it best if people have questions. I believe that we should, question everything, because the more you question, the more you learn, and the more you grow. It's assuming you question for the sake of growth and of learning, versus just to be contrary. And so with that, I want to make sure we have an open dialogue. There's no such thing as a bad question or a stupid question or offensive question. So feel free to open and ask anything, any way you feel it, to let it come out. Let's just everyone be respectful of one another in terms of our personality, but feel free to ask any question you have directed toward me or any party member. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started here. And I'm gonna introduce myself. I'm chairman here of the Black Panther Party San Diego chapter community division. And today we just decided, because of the week of it being the anniversary of the Black Panther Party, that we'll have a public community meeting, and we're going to plan to have more of these, especially until we get to a point where we can start having meetings out in the public, at social events. And with that being said, again, if anyone wants a copy of the information that we're going over, make sure to leave your email in the chat, and then I'll make sure you get a copy of it. So let me just go ahead and jump right in. The main concept and topic of today's class is just kind of going to be the symbology of the Black Panther. This is not an introduction, so to speak, of the Black Panther Party, but we will be going over a few things that we generally talk about, and one being the 10-point platform. But what we want to get into primarily, dealing with the symbology of the Black Panther as a symbol, as well as just a new generation of Panthers here in San Diego. I was hoping to have a few other chapters online, but so far no one else has jumped in. So with that, we just kind of stick to San Diego, and we'll break down certain aspects of the symbol of the Panther that we use here, as well go over some information that, regardless of your take on wanting to be a Panther, not just involves you being part of any grassroots movement as it applies to trying to liberate or work toward freedom of your people. So that's kind of going to be today's topic. And so let me just go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to jump right in. And from time to time, I'm going to just announce, to make sure everyone can hear me, that I'm not chopping up, and that we're doing good. So I know I'm not talking to myself. All right. That's first, as a confirmation, can y'all see the screen?
I can see it.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do with this is I'm just going to kind of break down the aspects of the symbology and the symbolism of the Panther. But I want to start first by just going over just a quick introduction of the symbol of the Panther, period, as it applies to the modern generations of the Panther. And then we'll go back into a little bit of esoteric meaning. The modern generation of the Panther, a lot of people are familiar with the Black Panther Party. It initially established itself in Loudoun County, Alabama. the symbol of the panther was chosen so that our people who at this point in time, you're talking about a society to where we were still basically an agricultural society within the United States, especially Black people. So moving toward the Industrial Revolution, but not necessarily full-fledged into it, a lot of Black people made their living off farmland. And with that, education was an option. So you actually had a lot of our people that were illiterate and did not know how to read. And so from that standpoint, it was chosen that we develop a symbol so that our people would know who best represented our interest. And that symbol was a symbol of a Black Panther. Primarily the reason why the Black Panther was chosen, as it applies to just general knowledge of the symbol, was because the panther itself is basically an animal that does not take more than what it needs in order to survive within this environment. The panther itself is a fierce animal that can definitely protect itself and hold its own, but at the same time, there's just not like in comparison to the lion, does not have this stigmatism of needing to be king of the jungle or needing to be the one in charge, but is a solitary creature that basically gets what it needs to get and then tucks and hides and goes away. So from that standpoint, it had to do with the fact that as a people, all we was attempting to do was get equality. All we wanted was our share. And in addition to the symbol of the Black Panther, the words that was chosen to go along with it was Black Power. Now, a lot of people have a negative connotation when they think about the concept of Black Power, simply because they're not educated as to the origin of that. When we referenced Black Power at this point in time, we was just simply saying that Black people should have the power to control their own destiny. So we needed Black Power. So in saying that, we reflected on the fact that white people had white power, Asian people had Asian power, and Mexican, Hispanic, they had their power. Everybody had power other than the African Americans. And so therefore, the push was that we engage in our own plight and our own struggle, and we developed Black Power. It was a rally cry for us to unite around the symbology of the Black Panther and unite around us taking control of our own legislation and recognizing that if we had the right to engage and decide how we best see our community be developed. And therefore we took the need to recognize being a part of political office, hence the concept of party. Because a lot of people, especially younger Panthers, take for granted or take out of context the concept of the Black Panther Party. So it was a political organization. It was a political body. It's basically about government. From that also grew the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which is what most people are familiar with, which started here in Oakland, California, on the West Coast by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton. So most people are familiar with that particular brand of the Black Panther Party. So that was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. So they took on the aspect of utilizing the symbol, and they utilized it in context with the fact that for self-defense, meaning that we had the right, again, through legislation, the right, again, through recognizing that we're human beings, to defend and protect ourselves from racist brutality and attack. In addressing that, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense established a 10-point platform that operated around what we need to do as a people to uplift ourselves. So what I want to get into now is just kind of breaking down the aspect of the new version of the symbol, because again, we're talking about what is the current generation and how it's carrying on the legacy of the Panther Party. A lot of times people don't recognize that, especially the average person just don't recognize the fact that symbology is everywhere and in everything. Those people that are any bit familiar with sacred societies know that symbols hide all types of meaning. I mean, this goes into the concepts of why McDonald's has the golden arches, It goes into the Shell gas station. Everything that, in terms of symbols, have hidden meanings a lot of times that most people just don't know. Architecture, building, things, everything is symbolic and has a hidden meaning a lot of times. So even within that, the Black Panther Party utilized some of those same concepts. See, most people, they just see a panther. But let me elaborate on what it is. And we'll start from left and go to right. Within the shape of the tail, the way the tail curves back, it reflects and represents the Sankofa. What is Sankofa? Sankofa is an African symbol that basically means to give back or return to your essence, and to make sure that you as a people go back and look back at what was done in the past, reflect on what your ancestors taught you and your elder generation taught you, and use that and utilize that information for your benefit to move the next generation forward. One of the things that we talk on and work on within the Black Panther Party, and this is most formations, is we deal with what's called generational foundational advancement. And what that basically means is that we recognize the fact that we must establish a foundation. And I go into that even in further as we get move on and get to talking. But the thing about that is Sankofa is Sankofa bird basically represents that. As you see here, reseeding and plant. A lot of times you hear people, when they just use common everyday slang, they refer back to dropping seeds. So you'll hear people say, well, I'm dropping seeds. And what they basically mean by that are planting knowledge. Is just saying that they want to implant something within your mind to keep you moving, or hoping that it'll sprout and grow. And that's the concept behind the Sankofa. So as you look at the panther tail, it's basically going back into the generational foundation and forming a foundation based on what our ancestors, what we've learned from our ancestors, what we've learned through history, and returning it back to the young generation or the youth. And why this is important is because, unfortunately, a lot of times our history as a people is not told, or should I say, is told to us by those that conquered or those that oppressed us. And so from that standpoint, we must take ownership of our own story. And therefore, we must teach ourselves our actual true legacy. And we recognize that as Panthers. And so from that standpoint, as it applies to Panther ideology, Panther history, we must be the keepers of our story. We must tell our legacy. We must make sure that we hold true to the idealisms and the beliefs and the operations of what the Black Panther Party means, which has to do with community, building a community and creating empowerment. So that is symbol of the Sankofa is hidden within tail structure. The next thing we go into is when you look at the way our panther, and this is San Diego, the panther that we choose, looks, is that it's looking straight at you, dead on, with its eyes gleaming at you. And if you look at the way I'm not sure if y'all can see my cursor move or not, but if you look at the front paws of the panther, it is crouched down, and the front paws are showing you the symbology of an arm or resistance, basically. And what that basically means in regards to the panther is that we must steadfast and recognize that we have to resist oppression. We have to resist being held back. We have to resist anything that has to do with our demise. And so having the spirit of resistance basically means that you recognize that you have to be accountable for the way your life moves and the way your life operates. And so within the front legs of our panther is the resistance symbol. And also, just going even deeper on that, when we talk about generational foundation advancement, the foundation upon which we sit here, if you take the arm and you take the foundation from where we sit, it forms the arm. The arm, in case y'all are not familiar with it, just to break it down super brief and super basic, represents the circulation of life. And the circulation of life, this is a symbol that was used in ancient Kemet or also referred to as Egypt, as well as Nubia. And the deal is this represented the cycle of life, which creates completion. Also, one thing that a lot of people don't know about in terms of just folklore or just old tales is that the idea of a wishbone, where you break it in half and you make a wish, formed the top part of the resistance or the arm, which meant polarization. So when you dealt with that and you break a wishbone, it has to do with taking the two halves and separating them. But the point being that the two halves represented polarity. And in breaking them apart, you deal with the idea of being able to separate something for the sake of bringing it back together or rejoining. And when you talk about rejoining or creating a union, then it has to do with the two halves reconnecting and reuniting. So that foundation upon which we sit, when you talk about the ancestors or the elder generation, the youth must take rightful place in reconnecting that bridge and that connection, which forms a complete cycle, which represents that Any questions about those two before I move on? Any comments on that? Can y'all hear me? Make sure y'all can.
You covered it before I even said it when you mentioned that it looked like the Ankh. I was going to say that, but you already covered it.
Gotcha. All right. The next one, and those that are members of the San Diego chapter hear us refer back to this a lot, and it has to do with what we call the trifecta or the Trinity. If you look at the face of the panther, the bottom part of it is, and I'll blow this up a little bit, just real quick. The bottom part of it here holds to his mouth. What's shown here is the foundation, and the top piece connects through the center to his eyes and then across to his ears. What you have is referred to as a Trinity. Within the Black Panther Party, our first trifecta that we go over. And again, this goes into the fact that there's a lot of symbology that goes on a day-to-day basis that most of us are just unaware of. What we talk about and what we build upon within our platform and within our structure is the individual, the family, and the community. And what we recognize is the fact that all three things must connect and go together, which forms the circle or the cycle. In other words, one of the biggest things that we find and one of the flaws we find within our family structure is that oftentimes when we teach our next generation basically how to grow up and be an adult, we simply teach them, go to school, typically go to school, get a good education so that you can be financially well off, so that you can raise a family, and they be financially well off, you can send your children to school and so forth, and repeat the cycle. The problem with that is not often enough do you hear us incorporate the fact that our family must basically be part of the community. Because if we're only teaching our youth to simply get a good job and get a good education, and so that they can basically raise a family, where is the connection in sense of the community? Basically, you have the individual planning for the family, that's planning for individuals, that's planning for the family, but not doing anything over here as a community. And what we recognize is that all three things must be equal. The individual must develop themselves, and then the family must operate as a unit, and then that unit must operate within a unit, which is the community. We also recognize the fact that, and it is just a basic fact, undisputable fact, that the dollar circulates within the Black community within seconds, in the lowest circulation of any other community there is. So when we look at that, we recognize that the connection that we have within community, within ourselves, within our family, connecting with the next family, is destroyed and is very dysfunctional. So therefore, in order for us to work toward liberation, in order for us to work toward having a chance at being empowered, we must reconnect with that trifecta. We must reconnect what it really means. And this goes back to where y'all may have heard it said, the cliche of it takes a village to raise a child. The idea behind that is that we have to connect ourselves back to our family structure, back to the community. And as we connect that family structure to the community, then it creates an accountability that we have within the community. And that accountability within the community is what creates a bridge or a connection to where we are able to circulate and raise ourselves to levels of being able to be in charge of our environment, being able to be in charge of our way of life. And so what we deal with when we go into this trifecta is recognizing that through that body structure. And so in looking at that, we talk about from the top down vision, having vision, and then having a body, which is the people or the workers, and then having a foundation. And see, within the Black Panther Party, we recognize that the legacy of the party is built upon community empowerment. The legacy of the party is built upon us actually working toward community programs. And I get in a little bit into that later on as well. And so as we dive into that and we simply talk about the symbology of the Panther, all of this is in there. Now, another thing to go into a little bit of the esoteric aspect is if you look at the way our Panther is facing, is again, you have the syncopa that's reaching back, but you have three of the legs which are basically standing right next to each other. And then you have the one out to the right. So these three here that are all tied together represents this Trinity that we're talking about. And then the unification of that Trinity goes into what you have on the right side here, which represents the unification of the three, which is the individual, which is the family, and then which is the community. There's another aspect of the trifecta also goes into the physical, the mental, and the spiritual, which is why we also reflect this within the golden ratio, which is that overall symbol you see here spiraling through. And the golden ratio is basically representing universal balance. And it says here that all life is fashioned through cycles of breathing in and breathing out, the birth and the death, day and night, zeros and ones, which just goes into computer science. Opposites are extremes. Everything exists within a harmonious system, and the key to realizing and appreciating this unity lies in the balance of nature itself, as expressed in the form of the golden spiral ratio, also known as divine proportion. The symbol of the Black Panther represents this balance and harmonious relationship with life. We dedicate our way of life to achieving and bringing about conditions that restore a balance within power, the all power to the people. And you hear us say that all the time, and a lot of times that escapes most people when you say the all power. Because again, I'm kind of going over it from an esoteric level, which is not, expressed too often to the people. So we say all the time, all power to the people. Well, what is all power? All power is the unification. All power is a recognition that the mind, body, and spirit must be unified, that the individual, the family, and the community must be unified, that the trifecta must be in place. And so all of that is covered in the symbol of the Panther. And so from that standpoint, these are the things that we stand upon, and these are the things that we want people to recognize in terms of the importance and the might of what that Panther is and what it represents. And in saying this, also, the reason why this is even able to be recognized or operated from is because the newer generation of Panthers have the ability and have the benefit of the legacy of what the previous generations of Panthers had done for us. And so taking upon that, what we did is we recognized that we needed to, add to that foundation. And that's one of the biggest things that we want to make sure that we work toward and develop and deal with is the fact that what we should not be doing is looking at the past in terms of what the Panther Party stood for and represented as nostalgia. It is not about just something that looks good and makes you feel proud. It's about putting in the work. And putting in the work means accountability. So therefore, when we stand upon this foundation that we talk about, it has to do with the fact that there's a certain level of accountability that goes into that. It's a certain expectation that we have from our members and that we have within the community in terms of what we must do. And so that symbology of the panther and donning that beret is the key to that. And so we just wanted to express that to our people. Now, one of the things we get into here is, and I want to talk about this, is within the original Panther platform, it spoke about what we want, whereas the new version has replaced the want as a passive position of not having power to we are, to imply a kinetic and active position of possessing power. The current Panther generations must operate from a standard of foundational generational advancement, which means to know the importance of keeping a legacy, like I said earlier, of work done by previous Panther generations intact as it applies to community programs, transformation from survival to living. And that's the key here. And we'll get into that as we go on further. But in order to build the next tier of foundation, the current generations must re-implement the trifecta of operations, which is why I'm explaining the symbology here. See, when Panthers take their oath and take their pledge to be a Panther, this is what they are standing on. And oftentimes it escapes a lot of the younger generation Panthers just in terms of how deep that runs, because dedicating your life to the people is supposed to be a lifelong process of work. Within our Panther pledge, that's what we ask. Now, we don't ask that people pledge themselves to be quote unquote Panther beret donning members all their life, but what we say is that as a people, if we expect ourselves to ever overcome the levels of oppression that are taking place, is that you must pledge yourself to be held accountable, and you must hold yourself accountable to what needs to be done in order to raise us to the next level, in order to overcome, certain aspects of oppression that we face on a day-to-day basis. And in order to do that, you must be willing to deal with it and grow as an individual, grow within your family structure, and grow within the community operation. So those are the things that we pledge from our members. Now, three things that I want to talk about in terms of the trifectas, give you further insight into it. You must be, as an individual, you must be able to perceive, and you must be able to define, and then you must be able to deal with the embodiment. You must be able to pursue, develop, and then deal with the spirit of what it is you stand for. Preserve, defend, and shadow what you stand for. So these are three aspects or three sections within the body of what we talk about when we talk about the trifecta. So every person, as they operate and move within the community element, must be able to perceive, pursue, and preserve. Now, when you talk about perceiving something, this goes into your sphere of knowledge or your ability to be able to decipher or analyze any given situation or any given problem that is before you. Because if you can't perceive what the problem is, then you can't come up with a solution. In the Panther Party, we like to always talk about problem solution. And so if I can't have the awareness of what the problem is and I can't identify it, then there's no way that I can pursue. And if I can't pursue, then I can't make change. And therefore, I'm not able to preserve. You see, everything stacks up to the next level. And this is also why we talk about the individual, the family, and the community, because they all come together. And then what we talk about, and this is something that most should I say younger generations that I've dealt with within the Panther Party have what they refer to as a 3Ds, which is define, develop, and defend. Within this structure, basically through our platform, it is basically saying we must define who we are as a people. And defining who we are as a people that's taking back ownership and taking back accountability and responsibility to what our conditions are. So we must define who we are. And defining who you are, excuse me, it puts you in the position of knowing that your legacy, knowing that your future all stands before your grasp, that you have the power, going back to all power to the people, to make that come true, to make those operations be enacted and put into position and into place. And as you define who you are, then the next step and process is to develop that. In other words, it's kinetic. Like we said earlier, it's a kinetic process. You have to take an active role to make things better. And this is why we also get into why it's important to reconnect the family with the community. Because if you're not working toward developing the community, and all you're doing is just developing the individual and developing the family, then you're not dealing with what we refer to as community reproduction or replication. So is one thing that from the natural science and natural law standpoint is that humanity in all life basically replicates. But when you take the concept of where we are as a people, and you take the concept of what's going on with either predator or prey or oppression and oppression, then you recognize that everything is duplicating or reproducing itself. And as a people, if we are not in the mode of reproducing progression, then that means we're naturally reproducing digression, which puts us in a position of being oppressed. We naturally take a position of being dominated when you live your life in that perspective. So this is why you must develop your means of production. And then going back to examples like, for instance, Tulsa, Oklahoma, that everybody's familiar with, when you have a situation where we are able to prosper, and then next thing you know, they come in and they destroy it. That goes into having a ability to defend. When you talk about natural law, everything within the natural law, within life, has a defense system. One of the things is that it becomes stigmatism and it becomes a negative thing when we talk about self-defense. Now, I want us to break that down even further, because recognize again, when we're talking about a trifecta existence, self-defense means physical, mental, and spiritual defense, because we are being attacked through all three systems. It's not just one. And unfortunately, a lot of people only recognize the physical. And so therefore, the fact that we're not in direct physical bondage as a people, we feel like we're free. But what's still enslaved is often our minds and our spiritual practices, which goes back to culture. So as a people, if we're not operating within our own way of culture, our own way of life, then we're still dealing with a form of bondage, and we're still dealing with a form of being domesticated. And so we have to be able to defend. We have to defend what we developed and develop what we define. The next tier factor or concept within that trifactor is the embodiment, which basically says that you must embrace and take in what is needed to grow. Whether we talk about the individual, the family, or the community, you must embody it. And to embody something means that, again, you hold yourself accountable for the level of growth and the level of operation and the way in which your community is currently operating. One of the biggest things that people, and this is just a general dysfunctionality, and not just Black, but a general dysfunctionality period, is that people play the blame game. People basically say it's someone else's fault, and they don't take ownership of things that are going on around them. Well, what we're saying is, whether you had a personally direct influence on something or not, the fact that all of us are in this together as a human race, as humanity, as a species, then when things are going in the wrong direction, and I would just say from a broad standpoint, when we talk about imperialism, when we talk about capitalism, there's no one that should be able to try to argue the fact that the way the humanity is depleting the natural resources of the planet, the way humanity is fracking the planet, the way humanity is creating large amounts of waste, overfishing the oceans, over populating the planet with cattle, which creates greenhouse gas, which, you know, based on the amount of meat that we eat and the amount of processed food, everything that we're doing is based upon generating capital and capital gains, which is a benefit, quote unquote, to the wealthy few, whereas the masses of people are caught up in the trap, and we all take part in making the wealthy wealthy, which depletes the health of the whole planet. So humanity itself is in a position to where everybody is basically playing the part of the demise of this planet, which in turn will cause the planet to need to do what it needs to do in order to make itself healthy. And at some point, what that's going to mean is eradicate itself of the current human race. And so we owe it to ourselves as humans, not just Black people, but as humans, period, to make change, to make the world a better way, develop a better way the world should operate, instead of being based upon imperialism and capitalism. So knowing that even goes back to what we say when we say all power to the people, is that the people must hold themselves accountable for the direction in which the world is going. So that is done through the embodiment. And the spirit is what connects you to everything else that is life, and your recognition that it is greater than yourself, it is greater than your family. But this obligation that we're saying that you must have ties directly into you being accountable as a human being to make things better. And then to shadow goes into the same thing when we talk about defense, but it also goes into the reproduction, because when you replicate a progressive design, then that means you are passing it on to the next generation, which is why we talk about the Sankofa, right? So looking at the symbol of the panther, he's stalking and staring at you through those eyes, which goes into the unification of the trifecta. But traveling down the golden mean, it gets you back to the Sankofa, which basically is saying the next generation is, I'm seeding and I'm planting the foundation for the next generation upon that I'm standing on of my elders. And so it is, you know, again, it is knowing that these trifactors, these elements must be dealt with in every aspect of our life. And so when we think that and we operate from that, what we're saying is that you're a Panther 24/7. And why we say that? Because it's not about, again, putting a uniform on, but it's recognizing that humanity must take its rightful place in making this world better. We must hold ourselves accountable for the actions or inactions that are taking place within this world. So before I move on, any questions, comments about what I've said so far? Tina, you there? I want to hear from somebody.
This is Tiana. I
Tiana.
definitely, yeah, I don't have any questions, but I definitely am learning a lot. And I appreciate it, because a lot of people, you know, I've heard a lot of people in the past, like, you know, when something goes wrong, they go, well, where are the Black Panthers? Where are the Black Panthers? So to hear, you know, how we're supposed to be current, and how, you know, we're preserving the legacy, and, you know, just all of the points. I take notes, so I took a whole bunch of notes. But, you know, it feels really good, because it shows that, you know, the Panthers are right here. Where are you? You know, so it's good to hear the work and all of the you know, the definitions behind it, especially, you know, what the panther means, the Sankofa, all of that. I love the 3 legs on one side and then the one leg on the other side to represent that unity. So it's you know, I'm enjoying it.
All right, anybody else? Thank you, Tiana. All right, I keep moving. Next thing here is even going into what we talked about. And see, one thing I do want to say, the stuff that I'm covering really applies to, again, whether you're a Panther or you're just anybody, period within the community that recognize that things must change, things must get better, and that we as a people have a lot of work to do. We as a people must again hold ourselves accountable to what's happening and or what's not happening amongst our family, our generation, and our folks. And so all it is in essence is just saying that, well, as a Panther, or if I'm joining the Black Panther Party, my point is that what I'm doing is I'm elevating myself to the level of publicly acknowledging and publicly taking a stance to where I'm going to don this uniform and I'm going to represent publicly as being held accountable for what work needs to be done within the community, and saying that I'm ready to make that difference and stand up and operate like that on a 24/7 level. And that's in essence what we're talking about. So in dealing with this, going into another aspect of symbology, within the body of the Panther, we got what we refer to as a cell theory or cell structure. This is the basic aspect of that cell theory or cell structure. And let me try to enlarge this a little bit. So what we deal with is, like within the element of the human body, the first line and the most defensive system you have is your membrane or your skin. The skin is the greatest level of defense within the body. Most people think it's the white blood cells, but it's actually the skin. Without your skin, everything will come in and invade your body and overtake it to a point to where your cells and your white blood cells could not protect you against the bombardment of everything that comes into your system. So the skin or the membrane is actually our first line of defense and greatest line of defense. So in recognizing that, going back to what we talked about being able to defend something, that means that creates that circumference or that 360 that we also talked about earlier within the symbology of the Panther. But the essence of our cell theory goes into what we call our field cores, which, breaking this down into 4 segments or 4 parts, we talk about the information, we talk about the resource or the economics, we talk about the community, and then we talk about the defense. So when we get into that, then what you're dealing with is 4 quadrants within the field core that stands on the foundation. When we talked about the or just basically going into the level of resistance, all of that is resting upon infrastructure. So infrastructure is ultimately like saying institution. So as a people, we must build infrastructure, because going back to what I talked about earlier about the way the dollar does not circulate within the Black community, what that basically means is that we become and operate as consumers. We consume, but we're not building anything. We're just consuming. And so what this is doing is taking us back to a position of recognizing that we must basically move away from being consumers and move into the position of knowing that we have to be producers. So in order to do that, and in order to operate that on that level, we go into what we call utilizing smart process, which is being specific about what it is that let's just break this down with an example. If I have a problem that I want to resolve, I need to be specific about what that problem is. And I say that because too often we take this shotgun broad approach to problem solving. And when we do that, oftentimes we don't break down that problem to the essence or core of what that problem, what source that problem came from. And so what we end up doing, because we don't do that, is oftentimes what we do is we cope, what we refer to as coping, or we just basically gloss over the symptoms. Let me just put it like that. Give you a good example. Most people don't think about the fact that when you catch a cold and you go to the store and you buy cough medicine, that cough medicine, if you look on the ingredients, it actually says suppressant, because there's not actually any medicine that you can take to cure the cold. currently available. It is suppressing your symptoms so that you feel better, going back to the spirit. And when you feel better, then it actually helps your natural immunity kick in and actually operate. Because oftentimes when we think we feel bad, then we are doing bad. And we actually help our system to continue to be sick. But when you have a progressive or positive angle toward this, then it will, you know, work itself out better. So when we have a negative approach about something, then oftentimes we're already dooming ourselves to that path. And going back to the example of the cold, all it's doing again is suppressing the symptoms. It's not curing the cold. So when we talk about being specific, that basically means that what we must be able to do is we must be able to address it from the standpoint of the actual problem, not the symptom of the problem. Because, for instance, give you another example that applies to just what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Police brutality. Oftentimes, what people think when they say, when they're dealing with or trying to tackle police brutality is they go after the quote unquote bad officers, not recognizing that that really is a symptom of a injustice system all the way around, from the top all the way down to the bottom. What you're dealing with when you deal with the actual cop out in the community, you're dealing with the low level enforcer. Not to say that the enforcer shouldn't be dealt with, but if what I'm dealing with at that point is a symptom of a sick system, a system that needs to be basically redone from the source of where the problem lies. The problem is not with the cop. The cop out there being oppressing you is a symptom and operating specifically off of the part that they can play in order to enact oppression on a group of people. But that goes back to their upbringing. It goes back to the perception that the United States has. It goes back to giving them the authority to be able to implement oppression. And where does that authority come from? And see, so that's how you get back down to that. They can't be given that authority. I mean, through their own self gain, that authority is granted to them. So when you talk about how that authority to oppress is granted to them, now you recognize that they're actually a symptom of a larger scale problem. So we have to be specific in terms of how we want to go about dealing with a problem. Then we also have to be able to measure the what goes into identifying and dealing with the problem, and then measure the output and measure the pace of the problem. So everything you has to be be able to be measured, and then it has to be attainable. And that's a big one when we talk about attainable, because oftentimes we have this pie in the sky mentality, which even goes back into what I talked about when I say the nostalgia of the Black Panther Party. See, when we operate from that level, then what happens is we go about this with unattainable realizations. Now, having something attainable basically means that you are breaking things down in the specific, you're measuring it, and you're pacing yourself, and you're dealing with it the best you can, which goes into having the ability to recognize that as an individual, you can only do so much. This is why we must, as a community, operate as a community. This is why we say the individual, the family, and the community must all become one, so that the things that we need in order to overcome oppression can be attainable. And then we have to make them relevant. So our measure of track in the work that we must do must be relevant. This is also why, as we go down to the next section, we're going to get into the new aspect of our platform. And I'm not going to go through it all, but I do want to just say that we have to bring back and make the platform relevant to the day, to this modern day time, versus just simply going off the nostalgia of the original, or one of the original 10-point platforms that the party operated from. And then you have to deal with things from a time-based standpoint, which basically means knowing that it's going to take time to get from point A to point Z. And so everything in between does matter. And so we have to break out our steps, and we have to recognize that time is a part of what it's going to take to be relevant, attainable, and measure it, and then get down to the specifics. So within each one of these quadrants that we're talking about as dealing with our cell theory and our cell structure, we utilize the SMART system. And so in saying this, again, these are operations in ways that we promote within our membership body to go about addressing it and helping to fulfill our vision. But the stuff we're talking about can apply to anything that you deal with in life. So the idea here is that just learning and being exposed to what we're talking about that we deal with from an internal perspective can benefit any and everybody that is paying attention to what's being talked about, because these are things, again, that you should be using just throughout your life, regardless of where you are, because it's only going to help you. It's only going to make you stronger. And that's the point of this class. Give me just a second, just a quick second. All right, I'm back. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about, and this is important because, again, when we go into being able to identify symptoms versus problems, we have to recognize the difference between the two. So we go into about talking about what is work. Work is defined as the exertion or effort directed to produce or accomplish something. So when we say that, is my goal here is to accomplish something. So when I say accomplish something, I need to be specific on what it is I'm trying to accomplish. I need to be able to measure what I'm accomplishing. I need to make sure it's attainable. I need to make sure what I'm accomplishing is relevant to our liberation or to the solution. And then I need to pace myself in terms of making sure that I say that by 5 months from now, this is where I need to be. That's one of the biggest things there, is because oftentimes we don't give ourselves an actual deadline. Then we're not actually working toward making sure that we close out or achieve a specific goal, because we hadn't defined how long it's going to take us to get from point A to point Z. So in saying that, that goes into defining what work is: exertion or effort directed to produce or accomplish something. Now, too often, instead of work, what we end up doing is work around, which is defined as a plan or method to circumvent a problem without eliminating it. See, this is important, folks, and I actually want a little feedback on this, because when we go about dealing with problems on a personal level, whether it be family level or community level, and again, this even goes into why the Black Panther Party established what was referred to as survival programs. The survival programs were basically meant to address some of the basic needs of our people so that they would have time to now operate and move on a higher level. So most people, when they recognize that the Panther Party did things for the community, they loved that about the Panthers. But what they didn't recognize and didn't grasp was the reason why the Panthers did these things is to hope that the people would now, through what we would call practice and participation and observation, that the people would say, you know what, I should be doing more with my life. You know what, I should be doing more for my community. I should be doing more for my family. I should want to do better for myself as myself. So the idea here is to create survival programs so that the people will now start looking toward what we call living. See, because too long we operate on a level of just surviving as a people instead of being able to literally live. There's a big difference to being in survival mode and living mode. See, as a domesticated people, we're surviving. We are working around or coping with our conditions. And so too often we substitute work for workaround. A lot of times when we say we're working hard at something or we're obtaining something, we're actually working around. We're actually just dealing with the surface level symptoms instead of eliminating the actual thing that creates the condition of oppression. Going back to the example of of a crooked cop. Now, ideally, typically what happens is that you bring justice to that officer that committed this crime against your people. But when you put this one officer, get them kicked off the force, put them in a position where they're being held accountable just like a regular citizen would be, own up to the idea of doing life in prison. What you've done was created what's called individual justice. But keep in mind, let's go back to our trifecta. Our trifecta says that what we must be able to do is address things as the individual, as a family, and then as the community. So when you eliminated and took that officer off the streets, you've done individual justice. But what have you done for the family structure to make it better? And what have you done for the community or the larger picture from which that officer came out of? Because let's just talk about it from that perspective. If this officer is the kind of person that inflicts oppression upon a people and inflicts racism through systematic and systemic approaches, as an individual, they are raising a family with these same concepts, with these same positions in life. So within that structure, let's just say this is a male officer. He has a wife and he has children. He is reproducing his same thought pattern of oppression and raising the next generation to do the same thing. So when you put him behind bars, more than likely what you've done is you kicked into gear and spearheaded a certain sediment within the family that's going to make them have resent to the society and probably be even more so out to create a higher level of oppression upon the people that they can reach out and touch. So now you have to, what you don't realize by only going after the individual is that you created a monster within that family. Within that family, again, because the family is what? Reproducing, it is going to raise and go about implementing that within the community. So by only dealing with one of the three aspects, these two things are going to take hold and going to repeat the cycle back to the individual. See, that's how it works. It starts as an individual, goes into the family, goes through the community in turn goes back to the individual, family, and so forth. See, it's a cycle. This is why when we talked about this at the top, which is why it's important to really embody, going back to that, the symbology here. Because what we're talking about is this trifecta. What we're talking about is this unification. There is no escape of this unification. So when you only target that individual, the family was still here, the community is still here, and the community is going to regenerate or reproduce that individual, who in turn is going to reproduce and create a family, who in turn is going to be a part of a society and a community. So when we go about addressing or trying to undo the levels of oppression that we face, and all we concerned about is our individual self, then we're not able to reproduce a positive growth or ability to overthrow or deal with the oppression that's going to happen with the family, and damn sure ain't going to be able to address the oppression that happens within the community, because we have a lack of common unity within our structure, which is why we have hoods. So we must address all three. They're connected and they're combined. There is no escaping this. This is what we call a natural law. It is a natural law and a natural aspect of life, all life. Everything that's on this planet is about reproduction and replication. But we tend to think that when we talk about fighting oppression, or when we talk about making ourselves better, that we can escape one of these, two of these threes, or one of these threes. We think we can just build up the family or build up the individual and not address the community. And see, that is the flaw that I talk about when I say within our structure, as how we operate as a people. So it tends to cause us to only work around. So we end up circumventing the problem and don't eliminate it. So see, it's like basically having an obstacle, and within that obstacle course, and this is just the reality of the situation, we're taught to go around an obstacle. We're taught to go over an obstacle. We're taught to move the obstacle out the way, but we're not taught to actually remove the obstacle from the obstacle course. You see, and this goes into what we refer to as neurolinguistic programming, because the way that we're taught to basically stay within line or stay within a segment of society through social engineering, we basically reinforce our own enslavement as a people. And I'm not just talking about simply being black, but I'm talking about as the masses of people reinforces their level of enslavement to the system, because they don't get these symbols that we're talking about. It is a lot of information packed just right here within just the symbol of the panther. So I hope I'm not over talking anybody. So hopefully y'all are grasping what we're getting at. So now I kind of want to go into just a little bit here of the 10-point platform. And let me say this first. Our work is not revolutionary or beneficial to solution-based output or outcome. Therefore, in our efforts to work, it does not mean the mission of the platform is being fulfilled, which again, now I'm bringing forth another trifecta here: empowerment, liberation, and self-determination. Those three things. See, if you start taking heed to what we're getting at when we talk about these symbols, then you'll start recognizing that there's a lot of tries or a lot of unifications that go into symbology all around you, that it just may escape you because you didn't know how to look at it properly. So when our perception is flawed or our perception is shallow, which is because we're not embodying what we're living and we don't actually get the definition, then this is what happens. It goes right over us. And so we have to be basically students of learning. So the new generation of the Black Panther Party platform, whereas the old, should I say the original, one of the original platforms said, we want, we're saying we are gaining freedom. So we're speaking from a position of empowerment. We're speaking from a position of instead of being passive, of being in action and being in motion. Because what we recognize now, and this just goes into the concept of what we learned through COINTELPRO. And if y'all are not familiar with that, look up counterintelligence, FBI counterintelligence program. The counterintelligence program was just basically aimed to destroy political organizations, and particularly they came out to the Black Panther Party and made the Black Panther Party public enemy #1 in terms of being something that had to be destroyed within what they refer to as serving as the most detrimental thing to the current status of the United States. So the Black Panther Party actually became public enemy #1 in terms of the structure of the United States. And what a lot of people don't know, it had nothing at all to do with the Black Panther Party for self-defense as it applies to the defensive posture of the weapons. It had everything to do with the social programs that they were developing, because what we were doing at that point is teaching our people to depend upon themselves. And by teaching our people to depend upon themselves, going back to what we talked about with the cell theory, what we did is through observation and participation, showing our people that everything that we needed to be able to sustain ourselves, we had within our community, we had amongst ourselves as a people. So therefore, we could stabilize our environment, and we could take ourselves out of the level of oppression by simply working together and unifying and operating within the confines of what we have and what we can do for each other. And that created self-determination. Having self-determination goes back to what we mean when we talked about being able to define who you are. So from that standpoint, we operated through We do liberation, self-determination, and which created empowerment. The thing about that, again, going into that trifecta, is that, and talking about it from within our platform, is that what we recognize is that from a psychological standpoint, we must be able to visualize and put ourselves in a position of recognizing that we can do this, that this is obtainable. And that's the key factor right there. Because if you don't have the belief and you don't have the willpower to recognize that what you are setting out to do is obtainable, then you won't give it your all. You won't put your heart into it. And that's just a fact of life. So it say here that we embrace the spiritual moral code of our ancestors, which goes back to the Syncopa, and we accept the accountability that Black people are free to collectively determine our divine destiny. So we recognize that we can determine our destiny. So therefore, we must be accountable for that, right? So this is why this is important. So we are gaining freedom, period, right there. So if there's nothing else that you can take from the platform, take that. We are gaining freedom, and we promote the power of practice and self-determination to determine the destiny of our communities. And see how we say we jump straight to communities and then defining the Black nation, because we have to develop and then we have to define who we are. Number two, we seek and establish avenues of proper living wage employment for our people, and continuously disregard the practice of codependency from systemic and systematic modes of oppression. So what we're saying and what we've changed from the original platform, for those of y'all that recall it, the original platform called for us to hold the United States government accountable for employing us. And see, the biggest flaw you have within that is if you are basically saying that the government must basically give you a job, then that is a direct contradiction to you talking about self-determination. Through self-determination, we must recognize that we can do this for ourselves. We can put ourselves in position of economic well-being, which goes back to the circulation of the dollar, or a circulation of currency and resources within our community. We have to recognize that we have that power, and that goes back to the all power. So that's what's important about that. We actively empower our own legislative representation in all areas of the United States government. Now, in saying that, through the power of joint African-owned ventures and co-ops, that's what's important, and the key there is that we recognize it's not saying that we're saying that as you participate in the process of government that exists within a corrupt system, that you can make all of the necessary changes, because again, if you're dealing with a system that is basically built upon corruption, even as you employ and put people in positions of authority that are and look like you, if the backbone of that government, or the backbone of the way that thing operates, especially recognizing that we make up a small percentage of the population, then there's only so much you can do. Now, within concentrated areas of Black communities, which goes back to the foundation of the Black Panther Party, which in Laos County, we made up of 80% of the body. So therefore, when you talk about areas to where we are the majority, then we can make a difference to that degree. But it still takes work, and it still takes accountability, and it takes holding people accountable. It takes a constant level of calibration to even be able to maintain something like that. So there's no such thing as just simply voting for somebody and then standing back and expecting them to do the right thing. And that's part of the problem now, especially, which is why we get into heavy when we talk about political education, because too often what our people think when they think about being involved in the political process, they just simply think about voting. And as that is the beginning and the end to it all. And that again is a shallow way of thinking that will not produce any actual results. And that's thinking surface level. And it's also thinking at things from the standpoint of maintaining yourself in a position of being inferior, in a position of being, you know, oppressed. And that's not how it works. Number 4, we fight against the use of discriminatory mortgage and housing policies in effect towards Africans and people of color and all oppressed people. I'm not going to go into detail about that one, but the bottom line is it came out, you know, and it's understood that a lot of financial institutions utilize the fact that you may be considered a quote unquote minority against you and give you a higher interest rate than they would the white counterpart. This is just facts. And they do it simply because you were black, or simply because you Mexican, or simply because you whatever, anything other than being white. And this is just one of the ways in which they implement racism and implement oppression. And so we have to actually fight against that. Now, number 5 here, and this is the main thing I want to jump on, is we employ education for our people to expose the true nature of this devilish, decadent American society. We provide an education that teaches us our true legacy and our role in present-day society. So we operate from an educational system that gives our people a knowledge of self. Having direct knowledge of self, our position in society and the world develops our proper relationship to everything else. And so what we're saying with that is that this goes back to what I talked about at the very top, in recognizing what we stand on, recognizing that foundation in which the body and the vision must operate. So as we get to that, and as we deal with that, the education is the actual conduit. So let me explain that, because that's another aspect of the symbology that is not expressed. I did not express through in talking about it. The fact that you have this open tunnel here. This open tunnel represents what we call a conduit or a path. And the path goes from left to right, up to down, or whatever. But basically what you're talking about is that the people must serve as a path or a conduit to make things happen. And when we deal with that within the body or our structure or our cell theory, we talk about recognizing strategy and recognizing tactics. But the connection between strategy and tactics is what we call the conduction. And so the conduction must take place, and this is what holds the trifecta or the trinity together. So that can be viewed also as a circle which connects the angles, the conduction, which is also why the symbol of was chosen within the field of the science or the field of physics within as the electrical symbol. So for those of y'all that don't know that, there's an esoteric meaning behind why this symbol was chosen in electronics, and it makes sense. And see, what people don't get is, like, for instance, when you talk about E equals MC squared, a lot of times when people think about the fact that Albert Einstein came up with E equal MC squared, he actually did not come up with it. What he did is he recognized a natural law and had the ability to be able to see the code, had the ability to be able to see what is already occurring. So he didn't invent anything. He recognized a principle of natural law and put it into a mathematical formula for the current generation of people. It is a myth to think that he actually did something that wasn't already done before. It is just that things get lost in time, which goes back to why the individual, the family, and the community must maintain a connection, which is why when we talk about foundation, we must build upon a foundation that supports the legacy of the past. Because when we don't keep intact our past, then future generations will not have that information, and therefore they will find themselves what you call reinventing the wheel again, because they didn't have a foundation that was laid to where this information would be readily available to them. So therefore they find themselves going back into like what happened within history where you had what's called the Dark Ages. You had a period of time that where people actually knew things, and then all of a sudden it seemed as though things went backwards for a period of time, and then things were recognized again. So to give you a perfect example of that, in ancient Africa, they knew about the solar systems. In ancient Africa, they knew about the sun being the center of this solar system, and not that the stars rotated around the planets. But remember, at a certain point in time, that was what European science said, is that the planet is the center of the universe. The earth is the center of the universe, and everything else is revolving around it. And people actually lost their life by trying to go against that mode of thinking. But again, this goes back into the period of the Dark Ages. So humanity knew better once before, and then we fell into this cast, and that has to do again with not having a solid foundation, and it also has to do with the fact that certain types of knowledge was suppressed. Going back to when I talk about that medicine, suppression oftentimes is a weapon. So recognize that even when we talk about this from the anatomy aspect of cold medicine, when we get used to suppressing things for the sake of dealing with symptoms instead of addressing real problems, it becomes habitual. So it becomes a habitual process for us to mentally suppress knowledge, mentally suppress our higher self, which breaks up this trinity, breaks up this trifecta. And once it is broken, now that individual would not have the ability to replicate a family structure that would in turn be able to replicate a unified community. Remember that, because the stuff I'm telling you about this applies to anything in life that goes on. This is not just Panther training, but this is actual training that benefits you across the board. But you have to know how to see it. So that's just what we was talking about on point number 5. Number 6, we embrace the skills learned in military service. One of the myths of the Panther Party is that we don't agree with dealing with military personnel. One of the things that we recognize, and let me break this down, is that we don't like the fact that people commit themselves to a form of slavery for the sake of going over and oppressing other nations and other countries. But what we recognize is that oftentimes we put ourselves in positions not knowing the results of those positions or not seeing the bigger picture. But at the same time, what we do recognize is that oftentimes, if any of y'all are familiar with the spook that's set behind the door, is that certain skills and certain knowledge, it is great that we possess, and that we should put these things to benefit to empower ourselves and empower our community. The Black Panther Party of the 60s, you had a lot of comrades that was in the movement who actually had military skills that was able to come bring that back and further advance the party. So for everything that we learn and whatever we learn in whatever we do in our quote unquote 9-to-5 a day-to-day job, these skills that we're operating with, that we're using, to benefit other people, we should take these same skills and utilize them within our community and build our structure up. So we recognize the same thing with the military service. So we don't shun military service anymore. We recognize that, hey, it's just another aspect of form of enslavement that's taking place. But what we're saying now is that for those of you that have taken part in that, we want you to hold yourself accountable for the things that you've learned and come back and serve the community with that stuff that you've learned. And so that's what we're saying. Going back to how we can continue the theme on the idea of being held accountable, holding yourself accountable. Now, number 7 here, reactive pursue the immediate end of police harassment, brutality, and murder of Black people and people of color. That right there is what most people know about the party. So not much of anything has changed in terms of the difference between this one and the original platform, because we still are faced with that. But we say here, we actively pursue the eradication of internalized violence or black on black violence. Why we say that and why that's important? Because too often we look outside of ourselves and only deal with what is pushed and thrust upon us in mainstream media. Mainstream media have you to believe that uh, cops killing us is doing more harm than us killing us, and that's not true. We are doing a lot more damage to how we treat ourselves. Goes back to us not knowing how to love one another than what they're doing. If we are able to clean up our own house, then the crimes that they call themselves committing against us are is blatantly obvious that they're going on. Versus when you have us killing each other, and then in the course of quote unquote a crime being investigated between blacks, what's happening within our hoods, them having to fire a shot prematurely or do this or do that, then it will open up the recognition that they are actually oppressing us, because if we're not oppressing each other and ourselves, then it's literally like night and day. So therefore, when there's no crime being committed within our communities, then there's no need to have the level of law enforcement that's in our communities, which the level of law enforcement that's in our communities is not justifiable anyway. But what I'm getting at is that when there's nothing that's being reported or to be reported within our communities because we're taking care of our communities, then all of a sudden the payroll can't justify the same level of law enforcement that is out there. And so we have to recognize how one thing that in terms of us resolving and solving one problem, how that can help to aid and resolve another problem. But to the same cycle of that, when we circumvent or we work around fixing one problem, it helps to magnify or create conditions of other problems growing from that. It's like when somebody tells a lie, you end up telling a small lie. Next thing you know, you have to tell a larger lie to cover up that lie. Then you have to tell even a bigger lie to cover up that lie. And before you know it, you got a whole book full of lies that you had to tell. The same thing applies to dealing with things and addressing symptoms versus addressing the actual problems. The more you address symptoms, the more symptoms you got to address. The more symptoms you got to address, the more convoluted the whole process becomes, which is why we're flooded with so much medication. So just keep that in mind. So as we talk about that from the physical aspect and talk in regards to medication, remember that going into the trifecta, the same thing is happening to us on a mental level and a spiritual level. So our life in general becomes very dysfunctional and convoluted on the physical level, mental level, and spiritual level, all because we're working around the problem instead of addressing the problem and covering up things with symptoms. And we do that on all three tiers. Number 8, we are establishing freedom for all black men and black women held in the national, military, federal, state, and county jails and prisons. And the key here is the Black Panther Party's duty is to awaken the people out of the cradle to prison pipeline. Cradle to prison pipeline is recognizing the fact that this country, out of all of the countries across the world, has more people in prison than any other country. Why? Because it still operates off of the same thing that built this country and made it the great nation it is today, and that's free labor. So free labor is still the root of capitalism, and imperialism, that in order for that machine to continue to crank and keep going, they have to continue to find ways to criminalize and institute some form of slavery. Whether that be physical slavery, mental slavery, or spiritual slavery. So don't get it twisted. All of these things are working in cohesion to keep us bound to a certain level. We consciously support all Black people when brought and tried before court by a jury of the peers or peer group or people within their Black communities as defined by constitutional law in the United States. That one wasn't changed much, but what we must recognize in terms of the flaws within legal terminology is that a peer group does not necessarily mean people that look like you. A peer group can simply mean people of your economic status. A peer group can simply mean people that live within the same size city that you stay in. So they've expanded and opened upon that concept of peer group in order to try to combat, basically saying that if I'm being held, in court or being tried on a jury as a black person, I want another black person to sit on that jury that looks like me, that is of my same background, ethnic background, in order to help deal with my case. So keep that in mind. Number 10, we are establishing, I want to go back to that. And let me say that again on number 9. We consciously support. So everything that we talk about within these, number 7, we activate. Number 6, we embrace. What we're doing is we're projecting active and progressive movement within our speech when we say the platform. Whereas the original platform, everything had to do with what we want and what we believe. And wanting and believing are operating from positions of inferiority and positions of not having power or recognizing your actual potential and your actual power. And so that's part of the problem. And what we recognize is that psychologically and through social engineering, how we speak upon action creates a response. And if we operate and speak as inferior people, then we are in essence helping to create and navigate a position of continually spearheading the process of being oppressed and inferior. But when we speak words of power to power, it helps to put us in the mode of standing upon what we actually say. And I hope that makes sense to y'all. So number 10, we're establishing land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace for our people in the contested zone. You got any questions on the platform before I move on? Anybody got any questions or want to make any comments on anything? All right, I keep going here. And we are in like a kind of sort of the last section, but this is a little bit more important here. Actually, I got 2 more sections, so we just go through this as fast as I can. Like I say, this would be long or it could be short. It just really depends. Okay, how to identify what you can do for the community. People will never attain what they can't see themselves doing. Let me read that again. People will never attain what they can't see themselves doing. Therefore, the first step to achieving your goals is to visualize yourself doing that goal. That goes back to what we talked about the perception. If you want to empower the community, you must first know that you are empowered. So that's going back to recognizing the fact that when we talked about that conduit that exists between the individual and the community going into the family, is that if I want to empower the community, I have to know that as an individual, I am empowered. As an individual, I can make a difference. I can make a change. And that's a state of awareness. And as individuals, if we don't recognize, going back to when we said the all power, if we don't recognize the level of power that we actually have as individuals as we come together, then you can't create empowerment for your community. See, this is why the system continually gets us to indulge in what's referred to as the rat race. The rat race is how it basically, in summarizing it, just goes into the aspect of creating individuals, pursuing individuals competing against individuals. It keeps us in this mode to where we're at a constant situation of divide and conquer. Because the more divisive we are amongst operation, the more we're conquered. And a lot of times we don't recognize that. So going back to first, you must know that you are empowered. This requires working collectively while addressing our personal dysfunctional baggage. and not letting division, ego, or lack of consistency stand as roadblocks to our completion. That's important. We must embrace being a lifelong student of living and command the best of ourselves while allowing the realization of pace of results, shortcomings in time/people management. And see, what we're saying here is goes back to when we talked about that SMART process. The idea here is that we have to come out of survival and be students of living. See, the thing about that is most people don't recognize the difference between, again, survival and living. And so therefore, we're saying here that you have to be a student of living. And so that's kind of where we're getting at with that. And then we have to command the best of ourselves while allowing the realization of pacing our results, shortcomings in time, people management. So we're saying in essence, know that nobody is perfect. Know that we want to pursue greatness and we want to pursue progress, but we are coming to the table with problems. So accept that, but don't allow that to be the obstacle to keep you from being able to move forward. Learning science of politics, self and collective governance, because again, when I talked about politics earlier, most of us think of politics as simply being voting. We don't think about self-governing or self-governance, which is why we talked about the individual, the family, and the community in the first place. And then the fact of psychology. So we must learn the science of politics, the science of psychology, dark psychology, as well as social psychology. Now, show of hands, well, let me get one person that knows what dark psychology is, because that's one thing that a lot of people don't know. Anybody know or heard that term, dark psychology? All right. So let me elaborate on that.
It's a, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Oh, it's kind of like when people are mentally manipulated or controlled, like, you know, like mind control, like things of that nature, and how to like, so it's important to kind of recognize how somebody can be controlling your mind or mentally manipulating you.
Thank you. That's exactly what it is. But too often, a lot of people have not heard of the concept of dark psychology. A lot of people are not aware of the fact that everything can be weaponized and everything is weaponized against us. And so therefore, when most people think about psychology, they don't think about the fact that there is a dark side of psychology. So we have to be students. Again, we have to embrace learning psychology on both levels. And now also the third one here. So I started off saying politics, psychology, the third one being warfare. And then I want to bring to your attention also, again, another trifecta: politics, psychology, and warfare. And in warfare, we talked already about the aspect of strategic, conductive, and tactical. Most people are only familiar with strategy and tactics, but are not familiar with the conduction or being conducive, which stands in between the two. And so that's what's important, because if you don't recognize how conduction works, which goes back to that arm symbol that we talked about, and the distance between the arm symbol and the T, or the foundation that it rests upon, which formed together, created the Ankh. See, when you don't know what it means to be conducive or conductive, then your strategy won't be able to be fulfilled when it needs to go into a tactical operation. And oftentimes this is the missing thing, or the missing key, that continues to escape people from being able to be successful. So within warfare, we must know strategic, conductive, and be tactical. And these things will be required by all who are serious, and is not an option. So what we're saying here is learning the science of politics, psychology, and warfare is a requirement for anybody that wants to stand up and start operating on a community level and operating at higher capacity. So keep that in mind. This is just not saying in order to be a Black Panther. But what we're recognizing and what we're saying, we're exposing you to people is the fact that these things that we're talking about basically go into any successful operation that is going to be mounted against your oppression. So being engineers will be the outgrowth if this path is kept reproductive. Remember how we continually use the word reproductive. So what we're saying here is if you apply what is discussed up here, it will automatically take you from being a consumer as a people to builders. That is a natural occurring process of approaching things the correct way. And that's just natural law is all I'm exposing y'all to. So let me break some more down. As you prepare with involvement at a higher level, keep in mind that most people are willing to embrace change when they hurt, learn, receive. And this is why, and this is actually goes into the element of what typically is worked out of protest. Typically when people go to protest is because they feel a connection to what then happened to somebody strong enough to where they want to go out and visually be a part of other people that is connected across the same hurt. But in order to, again, prepare yourself to be involved at a higher level, not only do you hurt, but you must learn and receive. See, hurt enough that they are willing to change. And that's the whole point of sparking from protest. If a person is not willing to embrace pain, whether it be physical, mental, or spiritual, there is no room for growth. That is the bottom line. Another trifecta that we discussed earlier, physical, mental, and spiritual. And if you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to hurt, there's no room for growth. Secondly, learn. Learn enough that they will want the need to change. See, and this goes back to what we talked about when we referenced the survival programs. The idea here is that put you in a position or a condition to where you want the need. See, too often our needs and our wants are not one and the same. Or our wants become needs in terms of things that create or hinder us from our growth. But we need to be able to want the need to change. So that's what we're saying. So we're basically saying that it really what it gets is a change in your perception. So our altitude for change should be constantly fed. This condition surrounds you with transformation and brings the journey to self-discovery into your grasp. So as you naturally want the need to change, it will put you on the right path. And then you have to be able to receive enough that you are able to change. And being exposed to a problem is not enough. Most people are logical in that they know right from wrong, but the awareness of the need does not mean that you are willing, capable, and ready. And that is the big thing that escapes us as what I would say organizers, is that we have to be willing, capable, and ready, all at the same time. Our willingness means that we are up for the endurance to pursue. Remember how we talked about pursue earlier. Our capability means that we have the capacity for inner growth, which have room, aka headspace, and the tools to carry out our task. And our readiness means that we are at the correct moment in our timetable to achieve deliverables of the task at hand and know how to use the tools at our disposal. And see, that goes back to when we talked about the SMART process. If you are not properly equipped for battle, then you will not be in a position to win. And if you cannot identify enemies, your strikes will be a product of lost time and energy. This is why I referred back and I brought up the concept of E equals MC squared. I'm just letting you know that everything that I said goes further down into something else. So that's why that was discussed. Any questions before we move on to the last part here? last part of this section. All right. So now here, and this is something I want everyone to just ask themselves and really embrace and think about. Are you a critical thinker or just emotionally critical? Big difference. But oftentimes they appear to be the same thing. Critical thinker or emotionally critical. So it says here, poor thinkers produce destructive results, which is a decline. Average thinking produces minimal results, which is a baseline, which is a 0. Good thinkers produce progressive results, or they're on an incline. Great thinkers produce reproductive results, 1 + 1, which is multiplied. Remember what we talked earlier about when we broke down the symbols of the trifecta. The idea here of the unification and the connection of the Panther, and addressing that as it applies to Syncopa, goes back into what we call the multiplier. If you are not achieving Syncopa, if you're not achieving reproduction, going back to these 3, then you are not actually benefiting the community. You are only at best dealing with the individual here, or possibly family dealing with the incline. But really, these 3 all address the highest level being the individual, because the multiplier is basically being able to take the progression that you got, that you've attained, and teach that to the next line. And by teaching that to the next line, and we're talking about properly, now you have that foundation so that the next line can take what they've learned and add to it, not decline it and not baseline it, but simply multiply it. And that's where we need to be if we want to be at a position where we can outpace the pace of oppression. So that leads us to talk about the type of people here. So unsuccessful people focus their thinking on survival. This is why we said that. This is why survival programs must transform into living programs for the sake of empowerment. You won't have empowerment if all you're doing is dealing with survival programs. Give you the perfect example. The Black Panther Party has a survival program where we feed the community. If we are feeding the community, that is a survival program. Once the community is in a position where it can feed itself, it is now living. But as long as we have to feed the community, we are stuck in survival mode. So even though that is a good deed for the community, you have to recognize that it is expected that the community overcome the conditions upon which it makes itself be reliant upon external aid. And so that is the problem that we have to address. So average people focus their thinking on maintenance. Operating from the mode of maintenance means that you are incapable of new production. Therefore, your drive is to maintain the structures, physical, mental, and spiritual, that have been provided for you. This also indicates a habitual pattern of linear learning. Now, that's a lot to take in on that. Again, if y'all want a copy of the assignment, make sure you email me your in the text chat. Just send your email, because I advise everybody to want to go back and relearn and study the information that's being presented. So now what we mean when we say habitual pattern of linear learning goes into the fact that basically what happens to us as a people is that we are taught things in a pattern that is non-productive and non-progressive for production. But we are typically taught how to basically get a job or how to exist in a capacity that continually serves the small, minute percentage of the wealth because of linear thinking. Linear thinking does not equip you with a powerful way of being a reproducer at all. So that's the average people. So successful people focus their thinking on progression. This is what we're talking about. Remember how The ultimate symbol of the Panther dealt with infrastructure. When we talked about cell theory earlier, we got into infrastructure, institutions, continuity, all require innovation, original thought. They pioneer and chart new paths, which is the seat of revolution. That is where we're trying to go. That is where we must go as a people. So we must be successful people, which build infrastructure and institutions and continuity. Continuity go back into when we talk about generational advancement, foundational generational advancement. That is creating continuity. Continuity also, and to give you another example, some of y'all may have heard of this, the what was referred to, and this was brought to the average person's awareness during the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission, there was a segment within that talked about what was called the shadow government. Are y'all familiar with, anybody familiar with that? Just speak on it real quick. The shadow government. Okay, what the shadow government is, it is a contingency and a
Hey, hold up.
continuity.
Is it?
Go ahead.
Oh, never mind.
No, go ahead. I want you to say it. I want to hear someone else talk.
No, I was going to say a shadow government isn't that what someone, or isn't that a government that's not necessarily in power, but that's working from the shadows, supposedly?
That's part of it. But basically, think of a shadow government as it applies to what I'm talking about continuity. There was a again in the 9/11 commissions, it talked about the continuity government, or basically a shadow government, which is a government that has the ability to operate in a position to where the front ground or foreground government collapsed or was destroyed. The shadow government would not miss a beat and would be able to maintain the structure. This is why, and I want y'all to really recognize how powerful this is. I could literally talk hours on just these trifactors. So what I just talked to you about was a shadow, which also went into defend, which also went into preserve. The continuity concept is basically about the preservation or the preserving something, which goes back into what we talk about here within the cell membrane, which is the infrastructure. So it's important to know that these words are all have deep meaning and all mean something and should mean, and if you practice them on any level of your life, it will help empower you to be a better person in terms of wherever you're headed from a progressive position. And so that's what's important about what we're going over here, is to recognize that. So again, when we go into that and we talk about the empowerment aspect of successful people, the continuity is one of the biggest things that we have dropped the ball as African people here, especially within the United States. We have not generated continuity. Continuity basically means that you are dealing with reproductive multipliers of progression. Okay? So that's the key. Not reinventing the wheel, not having to relearn once you become an adult what you should have been taught as a child. And that's where we keep finding ourselves. We typically, those of us that are brought into a level of awareness of the kind of stuff that we're talking about now, find this stuff out after we become adults. Something just says to us that things ain't right. And then we start digging and we start searching, we start soul searching. Next thing we find out is that we've been duped all our life. Well, now you're an adult. Had you learned and was taught these things as a child, where do you think you'll be at today? And so that's why when we talk about the multiplier, we talk about the fact that we have to take ourselves back to a position of being able to go over these things and teach them to the next generation as a foundation for them. So by the time they become adults, they are able to add to that foundation, not learn the foundation that they should have known as a child. So keep that in mind. Last thing, and I'm gonna sort through these for the sake of time. But these are definitions for growth. And this goes back to when we talk about defining, which is going into the 3Ds. Codependency. So we're going to give you some definitions to learn from. A relationship in which a person is physically, psychologically addicted or conditioned to a specific pattern that renders them incapable of operating from a position of self-control or self-determination. That is where we are, people. Codependent. That's what I mean when I said being domesticated. Functional disorder. This is how we operate as individuals. Existing without a known organic cause or direct mental structural change. Coping, but not solving the root or base condition of the disaltered, aka confined chaos. So most of us are living our lives when we think we're doing good as individuals. Keep it in mind, this is why I talked about how we promote individualism. When we think we're doing good as individuals, but yet our community is being oppressed, we are living functional disorder. That's what we're suffering from, functional disorder. Because as an individual, we seem to be doing well, but yet all our people are suffering. So we're functionally disordered. Programming, a set of related measures or activities in with a particular long-term aim. Weaponized programming is used to reshape a person's perspective and reality through unconscious or subliminal means to exert an unnatural, abnormal behavior. Often this behavior is cloaked in signals used to trigger on and off behavior without the person consciously aware or knowledge. By program activation from the root chakra, emotional level, most people stay in the feelings during decision making, and once that emotion is linked with value, logic is altered and the program is shaped into external control, which brings you right back to being codependent, is what we're getting at. And I know that's a kind of wordy, so I would just recommend that you take it and you go over it a few times and let it soak in. Going back to talking about syncope. Now, Operation Him, this is important, and it's broken down into three levels of acronyms. Handicapped education, keeping the youth ignorant of real mathematics, real economics, real law, and real history by way of inefficient processing methods designed to teach linear quantitative perception. That's what I talked about earlier. This is how we are taught as a people, not just Black people, but this is how you teach the masses. Very important you recognize that. So anybody that's not familiar with this, go to YouTube and type in non-linear thinking. Remember that, type in non-linear thinking and you will see exactly what I'm talking about. Irrelevant entertainment, keeping the masses on a pattern of supplied entertainment below a 6th grade level. This is geared toward non-productive thought encased in emotions and desires fueled by luster and consumption. Keep that in mind. Most of the entertainment that people engage in is simplistic. When you are engaged in repetitious, simplistic action all the time, you're not feeding growth into your brain. You're being stimulated by activities that suppress, that, remember how we use the word suppress, that suppress your growth. And when your brain gets used to doing things at a suppressed or non-growing level, the older you become, the more you get used to that, the harder it is for you to think on a higher level. So it is built within the way society operates that we continue to operate at a below 6th grade level in terms of what stimulates us. So therefore, higher knowledge and higher education is not stimulant to us. We're not attracted to it, in other words. And if we're not attracted to learning and growing, again, as we get older as a people, as an individual, it becomes that much harder for you to get out of the box, that much harder for you to grasp the things that are being discussed right now. Mind control, going back to what Brother Jason talked about. Exercising direct influence over another mind, either deliberately or inadvertently. Rhythm, and this is important here just so y'all can kind of get a reference. as a carrier is a #1 constructed weapon. It allows subconscious doors to remain open to pass vocal instructions by triggering sensual stimulation through musical sound. Basically, what I'm saying is, and every one of us are guilty of this. We'll hear a tight beat and we'll be bobbing and moving to it. But yet, all along, those lyrics that are coming along through that beat ain't got nothing positive behind them. They're talking about nigga this, nigga that, calling women's derogatory names, talking about how much money they can blow, how much sex they have, all these type of things. But yet we are captivated by the music, and so that music opens up our subliminal thought and allow those lyrics to sit and implant themselves in us. Form of mind control. Just an example of mind control. Puppeteering. This is a deep one here. The manipulation and controlling without the awareness of the directed application of that control. Thereby, the target is not capable of identifying the above strings of control. This weapon operates on a principle of blinding tears to keep each group isolated from the above and below, which misdirects the center focus and allow perpetual refashioning of the puppeteer system. And I want y'all to catch this play on words, which is literally what's hidden within the terminology of puppeteering. Puppet and tier system. Earlier, we talked about this going into the symbology of the Panther ideology. We talk about the above and below. And you hear this even within the biblical and religious texts. What is above is below. The same thing that represents within the triangle. The above being the arm, the below being the foundation. We talked about the tier system, making sure you keep a separation between the above and below. In other words, not knowing about that conduit, which goes into strategy and tactics. See, and that's what that represents, the strategy and the tactics. But the conduit, if you keep the conduit hidden from the people, they cannot connect the pieces together to create the unification, which goes into the golden mean, the golden ratio or the golden mean. So that's important. I'm just showing y'all I know I'm dropping some deep level science, but it's important that y'all grasp that, or at least be able to recognize that it exists. And then the more you expose yourself to it, the better off you'll be. Social engineering. The manipulation of the social position and function of individuals in order to manage and create desired barriers within society. This takes place on a population in stages that covers time sequences of years and decades as the society grows. The methods often used in deployment of self-regulation control factors that function outside of the spectrum of awareness of the target subjects. Give you a perfect example, and a lot of people have overread this and not seeing what it is. Proverbs 22:6. Train a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So what we're saying here is, if you teach a child how to be a follower, once that child is an adult, that child would teach that adult would teach the children behind it how to be followers. And that was teaching each generation to be a follower will be a perpetual process. Therefore, it is a self-designing, a self-inflicting mode. This goes into the concept that some of y'all may have heard of called Willie Lynch. The Willie Lynch goes into the fact that once you teach a people how to be dysfunctional, they will teach their next generation how to be dysfunctional, and you can step back and they will continue to enforce their own enslavement. That's social engineering. Power, the ability to do or act, capable of doing or accomplishing something through will. Remember, we talked about will earlier. The possession of authority, of control, or command over others, be a positional, informational, situational, relational, punitive, coercive, or charismatic. And that is important because these are the ways in which power is enacted. And so we have to be aware of these. And so now we get into the last thing I want to talk about, which goes into the aspect of what we must do. Again, even talking about the idea of smarts processing to make things happen. Every step, every problem that we want to solve must operate through initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and then bringing closure. So ask yourself through initiation, what attracted you to take action, to take an active role in the community empowerment? This thought is what set up the process of getting involved. Therefore, you initiated a step. But then planning, as you decide to walk a specific direct action must be taken. This is the start of planning. Every move you make must be done with strategic awareness. Execution. This is the actual stage of movement. Steps are being taken, work is being started. Before execution can work, which is in parentheses for you, the proper tools and use of these tools must be known, which goes into planning, aka willing, capable, and ready. That's why we brought those trifectas together. Monitoring, controlling. This is the actual management of the work and tactical operation. This is also referred to in the position of maintenance or calibration, which is why we talked about that. To monitor implies that work is watched to have direct access and witness the direction. Because if you're not witnessing the direction, it can get out of control, which is why you monitor and control. Controlling implies the guidance of the action to keep the task on a directed course of intent. That's the key, keeping it on a direct course of intent. And then everything that you do must have a closure. Initiate, planning, execute, monitor, and control through management, administration, aka strategy, conduction, and tactics. And that goes into the very last thing, which is where we want to go to, where we want to be, and that's self-determination. The ability to determine and control the process of defining who we are, what we are, when we are, why we are. And an added point of when involves the state of consciousness and recognition to perception, which is how we started the discussion dealing with the perception of a symbol, which is observed through time and space, which is why I even threw in the concept of E equals MC squared so that you can recognize that. And the why is because we, as defining our collective, say so and shall organize around this self-proclaimed authority and exercise to the point of liberty or death, which is why we got into the idea of why the platform was changed in order to create conscious and active direction. So to sum it all up here, now you are armed. If you take the information that was provided to you today, you're armed, which is arranging righteous mechanics every day for the directed positions of empowerment. So remember that acronym. So when someone approaches you and you say, I'm armed, that's what you're talking about. Arranging righteous mechanics every day for directed positions of empowerment. Any questions? That's the last of the lecture. Anybody got any questions or comments before we close out?